Hi, everyone. As we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I am dialing in from today to join this webinar. I'm based over in Melbourne on Boon Wurrung country, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging, and also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which everyone here might be beaming in today to come join us. Acknowledging that the land that we're all living and working on was unceded land, is unceded land, and pay my respects to the individuals who continue to give us spaces to learn and have conversations like this one. So I'm so pleased to have this conversation today. My name is Alison. I manage the education space here at Engineers Without Borders Australia, and I have the pleasure of introducing this space, being here with you all, and joining us on this journey that we have ahead of us for the next hour or so. This year, EWB launched the strategy that will guide us into the next 10 years. It's thoughtful, it's bold, and it's something that I'm really proud to play a part of. Since our launch, we've been convening spaces to share our knowledge and learn from others as we start out on this next stage of our journey as an organization and as a community as well. So this evening is one of those platforms, and I'm so pleased that everyone has joined us here, and a thank you to our panelists for making the time to contribute to this conversation. It looks to be brain stretching, it looks to be thought-provoking, and I'm pleased to be able to join it. This evening's event also sits in the context of much of the end of year wrap up for our university education programs at EWB. So after the course of this week, we've had the pleasure of hearing from over 50 students from 21 universities at the EWB Challenge Series Showcase event. You may have seen that advertised alongside this event. Perhaps some of you were there as well. Students from first to final year pitched their human-centered, their sustainability-focused ideas and research, responding to the briefs that were developed by EWB, our partners, and the communities that we work with. It has been an incredibly inspiring week to see the depth of consideration that these students have put into their projects, their effort to understand a context, their effort to listen to the insights of the stakeholders that are involved, to generate ideas that are truly relevant to a context, and to try to reflect on that process throughout as well. As one of our community partners representatives shared in that closing judging, it does seem like the sector may be in good hands. We've made strides. Over the past 15 years, EWB has been nurturing the growth of humanitarian engineering through education and through practice. We have activated and cultivated a movement of new look engineers. Since the pilot of the EWB Challenge in 2007, the curriculum integrated program that runs with first year students, it's reached over 100,000 university students. And since the first Humanitarian Design Summit, the study tour program that we run in 2015, that 2-week immersive study tour has engaged over 1,500 students. And over the course of EWB's time, there's been around 250 field professionals who have contributed their skills and grown their own learnings through working with EWB and our partners in country, in context. And as with many EWB programs, about half of those volunteers were women. That doesn't even count the professionals who volunteer their time in a pro bono capacity as well. These are the future fit professionals grounded with a community first mindset and equipped with social and technical skills. They are capable of sensitively ideating solutions for global issues and working respectfully with the communities that are involved with and impacted by their work. Yet we live and we learn and we operate within structures and systems and power imbalances that reinforce those very issues that we're trying to solve. So there's more to do. We know we must continue to challenge our thinking and listen to those who are on this journey with us, wherever in that journey they might be. those who bring insights and questions and knowledge that will add to our own. Just this week, the Design Summit program that I mentioned was acknowledged by the Australasian Association of Engineering Education with an Engineering Education Engagement Award. And that was a recognition of how that program has demonstrated a really excellent standard of engagement with stakeholders across the education sector. And it's such a lovely example to share because this is how EWB operates. This is how we work. We've been able to create platforms for our communities and our programs for people to truly collaborate and bring their strengths and create spaces to learn from and see benefit from others as well. And spaces for that diversity to really flourish. This organization and the people associated with it, I am so proud to be part of, because it's been critical to the evolution of engineering education. And the team that I have around me now, we are filling big shoes. We are building on the foundations that were set over time, years before each of us joined. We know our education and training offerings, they sow these seeds, they enable this far-reaching impact. And so at this stage of our journey, it's an incredible opportunity to sit back and think about these times that we're in and what is next. We don't do this work on our own, far from it. We listen, and we want to give you the opportunity to do the same. So in a moment, I'm going to be beamed out to join you as an attendee, which I am so pleased about, because it means I get to sit and listen to the incredible individuals you're about to be introduced to. You may not realize it, but we have some tech wizards who are helping to make today's webinar as smooth as possible. And so they asked me to let you know that over the course of the conversation, if you can pop your comments and questions into that Q&A, we're not going to be using the chat function, so use that Q&A. And if you see someone post a question in there that you'd like to hear answered, give it a thumbs up, and our tech folk will monitor those questions and invite a few people to join the panelists in the second half of the session to ask their question live. We also have the pleasure of having Max, our graphic recorder, with us as well, who will be capturing the conversation through art. So we have something visual to share as well. So thank you, Max, and we're so pleased to share that. We'll be sharing that in the follow-up comms from this event. So that is all from me. I believe the tech folk are about to remove me from your view, and I can hand over to my wonderful colleague, Sarah, to lead us through the rest of the conversation we have the pleasure of listening into today.
Thank you, Ali. I beam into this space today from Nuinina country, which is about a 20-minute drive south of Hobart. I'm up on a hill which is perpetually windy to the point of wondering if you'll ever be warm again. And then you head down into the valley where the gap in the ozone layer ensures that when the sun comes out, you're quickly burnt to a crisp. It's quite an extraordinary place to be speaking to you from today. And I would like to acknowledge the custodians of this land, past, present, and emerging. So I have the honor to speak from this place. I move my head because I'm looking out the window, and when I've been here, often I can cycle around where I live, but we need to sort of drive to get anywhere. And in this strange moment in time, I am surrounded by extraordinary beauty, and at the same time, driving this car, I'm thinking about the fuel that's going into it. I'm hearing on the radio people coming from the mainland and hearing more stories of this pandemic that we're dealing with. I'm going to the ocean where there has been a big escape of farmed Atlantic salmon, which are now the great Tasmanian salmon escape, which are now causing who knows what impact to the ecosystems, and also providing delightful dinners here, because we have managed to catch a few. I say all of this because when I got into engineering, I got into it because I wanted to create change, and I thought that engineering could be the way to do that. And I anticipate that a lot of people in the audience are coming from a similar place. However, I know for me, when I then got in, I felt a bit caught and trapped by the variety of systems that we were in, from tenure processes to the patriarchy, the whole gamut. And then I was preparing for this conversation, and I read a quote from Alan, which I'm going to go to in a moment. So hold that thought, because I have realized that I haven't introduced my guest, because I'm so freaking excited about this about this conversation. And I'll bring us back there to step into what the future could look like from this bizarre moment in time, particularly considering ourselves as technical professionals. So I anticipate that the conversation could fly once I stop talking, so I best introduce our guests before I do hand over the reins. We have Arabella, who is Principal Strategist and Coach at Douglas and Associates. Arabella uses a myriad of skills to consult, advise, and drive problem solving for organisations. Arabella is a Minyumbu woman. Please correct me if my pronunciation is not right there. And is also Principal Strategist in her family business, Curry Country, which I certainly encourage you to look up post-webinar. We have Kai, who is Head of Strategy at Small Giants Academy, good friends of Engineers Without Borders. He leads the Academy's strategy around education and storytelling initiatives, and is about to launch a Masters of Business and Empathy. Welcome to the new world. We have Simon, who is an engineer and family man based in Melbourne and Managing Director of EBM Pats Australia and New Zealand. This is a world-leading fan and motor manufacturing engineering firm, award-winning in sustainability, and from all of my conversations, always willing to do things a bit differently, particularly within the culture of the team itself, because what is an organisation without its people? Now, back to this quote from Alan. So putting you in the spotlight here. Alan stated in some comms for this webinar that I feel like this just nailed what has been really pertinent for me in delightful prose. So as technical professionals, we've broadly been expected to be apolitical and asocial, trusted to be impartial. Alan, you go on to say that our role as designers and creators is inherently social and political. That through understanding our place in the system, why our work exists, and what we serve into, we can have a voice in justice. Now, when I read this, what it evoked in me was hope, excitement, and a renewed spark for conversations with my colleagues, for watching these student presentations throughout this week and having this conversation. So to kick us off, I'm curious for my guests, what did that evoke in you? How did that land for you? And anyone who's willing to jump in.
Alan, could you give us a little bit more? Do you mind if I, Sarah, do you mind if I ask Alan to start? As she wrote it, just to be bloody awkward. Right?
Oh, that's fine. I think, yeah. Yeah, of course. Thank you also for the introduction. Yeah, I think it's something that's been rolling around for a long time in my head, but also in the work that I do. I'm a PhD student currently at ANU, and I've been involved with humanitarian engineering for a while. But yeah, I guess a little bit like Sarah, I got into engineering to solve problems for people. And throughout my work and throughout studying and things like that, you are not always shown the people side of things. And To me, it's so interesting that we design things for people and sometimes with people, but we're not really taught how to understand people or talk to people that well, which seems like a disservice to all of us, to everybody involved. And as designers and engineers and technologists, I think we should be a little bit more connected. And so I guess to me, that sort of thinking, I was reading an amazing paper by Erin Check, she's a sociologist and an engineer in the US. And yeah, this positioning of our ideologies as engineers, we often don't question them. And I think that's also an interesting place to start to understand what are the paradigms that we have set up around engineering and what expectations have been placed on us by society, but also that we place on ourselves, and how do we interrogate those a little bit further. Don't know if that's helpful, Simon.
I think that's very helpful. I think that's great, mate. I agree completely. For me, it's all about community. Those of you that know my organisation and EWB and everything that we do as an organisation is centred around community, whether it's the people that we interact with or whether it's the people that I employ and the families and their extended families, etc. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, sorry, Scott. How's that? Is that better, mate? Yeah, absolutely about communities. And you're right about that interpersonal skills that we're not really very good at, being introvert engineers. And one of my roles, certainly I employ 35 engineers, and I have to send them out into the world to talk to people and to influence people, to get people and gently persuade people to do good. And it doesn't come naturally to us. And we have to be supported and given the tools to do that. And then you break the paradigm, because then we become individuals, and individuals influencing community in the world around us. And then that's how we can make a difference in people's lives. Talking back to your first line, Ellen, and how we can solve problems for people in the lived world. And we have to find our voice. Yeah, I think so. Some great words, mate. Lovely. Thank you.
Simon, you touched on there. Some awareness around self and becoming individuals. Kai, in our conversation, you spoke to this really interesting point that you were looking through in the Masters of Business Empathy, which is around often a leadership course will look at what is the work that one needs to do with oneself, and this is broad generalizing. What in the if we're then in more of the, say, social advocacy area, it's like we're doing good, we're doing great, and we're doing the external work. You've spoken about bringing these two together, and so I'm wondering what your response is here, and what's the gap that you're moving into with this Masters of Business Empathy? What does it even mean? Why is it required?
I'm trying to pick up the strands here, and I was inspired by Ellen's quote, and I appreciate that. And maybe, the long way around to talking about the MBE, if that's something people want to hear about, is just to address the question of context. Because I think when I was at uni studying civil engineering, and one of the things that I was most struggling with was the fact that our education at the time just really refused to engage with the social, the political, and the environmental context that sits around our work. So it wasn't that the education and training itself was bad. I think I was taught by some exceptional engineers, but the lack of context was just this, it was like a blaring speaker in every session that was just banging at my ears. And it wasn't until I found at that stage a very early incarnation of an EWB chapter that it provided that context for me. And actually, I can definitely credit EWB for allowing me to finish my engineering degree. Although I can also blame EWB for extending it by a few years because I volunteered so much, which I'm sure isn't a solo story in this room. So I guess when I think about it, and I fast forward to now, I feel like when we're thinking about the context that we're in now, and the context for this conversation, we have to stop and obviously appreciate that the year has been what it's been, with fires and huge uprisings against systemic inequality in the United States and other places, and of course the pandemic, which has reassessed everything in a brutal way. And I think my reflections of late has been that really contemplating from a historical perspective, what is this year going to mean for our lives going forward? I suspect it's going to be the biggest social and economic disruption since the Great Depression. It's the equivalent of our Industrial Revolution or our World War. And so I've been thinking about, how is it going to define us? How are the future generations going to reflect on the moment? And what are we going to do with this moment as it presents itself? And I think in that context, coming back to your quote, Ellen, and I think this is where you're heading, I think impartiality, or the idea of neutrality in a moment like this, when the world is on fire, is not neutral at all. In fact, it's not balanced, it's not just, it's not right. And I think our role as good engineers, but maybe more broadly as good citizens, is to look at our community, look at our work, look at our lives, and look at our sphere of influence and work out how we act from that place in this context. It's not about doing everything. It's not about starting a movement and leading from the front. But I think we can all, once we have a look at that context, take steps and act from where we are. So that's kind of my main reflection. And then, of course, I'm really exhausted after the year. So the moment calls to us to do that, and I'm exhausted. And so there's a kind of paradox that I think we'll be reflecting on over summer and hopefully coming back a bit energized.
I have got to pass this over to Arabella off the back of that that placing us in this time space, because Arabella, when you spoke of these challenges as a gift and pulling us into a new paradigm and into a time of feminine leadership.
I think there's a couple of things. And first, I'm speaking from Minyinbul country, my own country. So I'm on the far north coast of New South Wales. So I should acknowledge my own country where I'm sitting today. But there's a couple of things that were thought-provoking. One is that if there's an absence of learning about people and social and political behaviour, it seems rudimentary and pivotal that should be integrated into engineering thinking and thought, like across many other disciplines, as medicine should incorporate social and political, even theological positioning, so that you understand yourself a bit more holistically. So I think the gap in that needs to certainly be addressed, that you need to understand people and place. And when you do that, you understand the lens in which you see people in place. So you have to, in Australia, decolonise your mind somewhat to appreciate what is available. So that would be, if I was constructing a new course, rudimentary and engineering through every year, and how you evolve in that philosophical understanding about relationship. We are relational beings. All human beings are relational. Very sophisticated engineers get to a point of finding a professional space in which they can exercise that a bit more readily outside the constraints of the disciplines. But that's not the focus of this time in this place. The Aboriginal pan-Indigenous theory around the globe, which happened in the Red Moon after 2018, was that we are in a time of 100 years of female energy leading. So my own family is of the belief that COVID is an extension of us having to humble ourselves to the environment. And until we get that right, we'll continue to be constrained. That's the global thinking. Native Americans call it seventh fire or seventh generation. It's a process of prediction. So the COVID impact, and that was the question I thought that Kai asked or mentioned, which was very interesting. If this in fact is World War II or our Industrial Revolution, I have yet to see this year phenomenal engineering responses to the COVID. I've seen people having to be housed medically on streets. There's an inefficiency of the thinking that happened in the last decade. COVID was expected, a catastrophe was expected. And we have not used in the last decade, just look at a decade, really great engineering concepts to solve and assist the urgency that we've created. it's not a criticism, it's just an observation, that if we accept that time is a repetition of different large impacts, the question for young engineers is, this is not the first virus. In fact, it's going to be one of many. So if it's in your consideration to be responsible and problem solving, how do you use your best creativity? I'm not an engineer. I'm a lawyer and an economist by trade. So I'm not an engineer, although I work with thousands of engineers a lot in what I do. So I admire their thinking, but I think they are constrained and understanding themselves as really alchemists or creators. Engineering is no more different than painting. It's an extension of your skill to be of best service to yourself and to others. If you don't see it in those ways, you will eventually, or you will leave it and exit it, and it will be something else for you. That's the way of life. So I am concerned. I think about it now, it's true. We had the prediction of COVID, people were aware of it. What are the engineering responses? And just as we were sitting, mind you, I've only given it less than an hour of thought, so maybe I'll give it a few days and I'll think of some engineering observations that I've observed in this crisis over the year that have really been profound to me. But if I was to set a task for young engineers, it's what would you be doing now to use your best creative spirit to serve humanity in this space? Not reorder it back to what it was, but how do you apply your good thinking to be of service to it? So for Aboriginal people, not only here, but globally, Indigenous people globally, we are of a view that female leadership will happen. That doesn't mean more women will lead. It actually means female energy and men will also make a resurgence and a comfort in how they make decisions. So I'm not concerned. I'm totally exhausted this year, like a lot of people, exhausted in a unexpected way. But of course, the centering of COVID about what is important to you, who you are, the fact that you don't need to be working with a de facto team who know you more intimately than your own family. And perhaps you've readjusted that this year, that your workforce is not your most intimate relationships. You've actually gone back to having real people in your life. Those things all serve us. It's a question on how you want to reorganize yourself, not go back to replicating what was occurring. In Australia, there's an absence of social, political, theological understanding about relational living, which is very much demonstrated or limited by the sciences and limited by engineering as a body of science that can both inform and protect and stimulate community. And you see those as a luxury in society rather than the ordinary, and then extending out. So I guess that's my sort of thought about what's happened so far. Conversation so far.
Thanks, Arabella. And my guess,
yeah.
I guess I do encourage you, if you'd like to bounce off of that or ask questions yourself, I can also direct us somewhat.
Maybe I can pick up,
Yes.
Arabella. I loved what you were saying, and in particular picking up on this idea of I guess I interpret it as the need to rebalance how we look at leadership. And you're picking up on the feminine leadership as a huge part of that. And I fully subscribe to that. And I agree that doesn't necessarily translate as only for women. That's a rebalancing of leadership for men and women, and a revaluing of the feminine, something we definitely subscribe to in everything that we do. And there's other things that I think need to be rebalanced in that question too. So you mentioned, Sarah, this idea of inner work and outer work, which I think is something that some people are really good at the inner work. They spend time in therapy, not because they feel like they're unwell, but because they feel like they want to develop themselves. They read books and do courses. Some go and learn how to meditate or do spend time focusing on themselves in that way, in personal development. Other people rage on the hill and they hit the barricades and they lead movements and they participate actively in the world as their way of expressing themselves. And both of these things are perfectly good, of course, and really positive ways of expressing yourself. But I think, again, this time calls for us to think about the connection between the two, the connection between doing the inner work, which is required in order to, the philosophical, the ethical, the spiritual, the empathic work that's required for us to navigate this extraordinarily uncertain time, and to manage our own well-being in doing so, but coupling that with the outer work and the practical and the systems change, which actually I think is what we're all called to do at this time. And so being able to find a way to balance those in your life, I think, is one of the great challenges, and certainly something I struggle with on a almost daily basis. But I think being conscious of that is helpful. And maybe the last thing in terms of rebalancing is between the individual and the collective. So I think we've been taught for a long time in our education system that leadership is an individual pursuit, and that it is something that we do on our own, and we are taught how to kind of be as a leader. But I think, again, the idea of sort of individualistic leadership has to leave us if we're going to navigate this moment well. And the idea of collective leadership, circle leadership, working much more broadly and much more democratically sounds way too technical, but the sort of deeper version, or the deep democracy interpretation of that, is also something I think we need to move towards. So yeah, I think it's a time for rebalancing. It's a great way of summarising it, Arabella.
Sort of, there's this.
Well, I need you to say, like, the Native American word is a word that we use. It's called consensus. Consensus is the idea that you talk until people are all satisfied. So it's a Native American word, been brought into English vocab, and to reach consensus means to talk until people have both us all satisfied in some way. So even that thinking, like, again, if you know people and you know societies and you know the structures of decision making, we are surrounded by great clues which we don't adapt to, but which are available to us. And broader satisfaction, so communal satisfaction, everyone feeling at least somewhat satisfied, is healthier for everyone, even the decision maker, even the leader of the group. Every leader has that experience when they try to get everyone on board with an idea and reaches a tipping point of being okay with it when there's a general consideration and acceptance and there's value for it. So that, in the framework that we live in, would be considered to be female-led conditioning, in a lot of methods of thinking and business thinking. But that in of itself is who we are as clans and as groups of people. That's our natural energy and wanting for satisfaction beyond ourselves. Those ideas and knowing how to articulate that through the movement of what you do as a profession is, I think, the only way that engineering will move from where it is to really get the excitement and the energy of attracting great thinking. It's almost, multiple ways that you may consider a problem. And hopefully it doesn't stay in the luxurious market, but it embeds down from the simple way that people operate. Sorry, I just needed to mention that because, again, I'm like, it's all about the education, right?
Thanks, Arabella. And what I'm hearing in this is, what's continued to come up in this is this idea of creativity and excitement and activation of will, and that really occurring through us as being relational beings. I know that Alan, you're exploring this in your research, and we had some really fascinating examples. I'm sort of thinking about how to pull this down into, what does this actually look like when I'm in my day-to-day? What are the kind of conversations that then create that well of creativity and excitement? I'm curious, Alan, if you have any examples that pop to mind. And I'd also be curious about Simon, because I know that this is a culture that you really foster in your organization.
Simon, did you want to go first? No. I guess there's something interesting, and it's interesting you also pulled out relationships. I was also thinking about relationships from what Arabella and Kaj both said, and thinking about that complexity of thinking, complexity of approaching problem solving. As technical professionals, we sometimes talk about Newtonian thinking. We like cause and effect, and we like things whittled down to a very easy to manage way of looking at things. But relationships are complex, and humans are complex. There are these squidgy things at the end of our design we need to think about, or, you know, there's so much going on all around us. And I think that is really interesting to think about complexity of relationships, but it's hard to bring it down to what I should be looking at and what I could be seeing. I'm really interested in the idea, Arabella, of that creative spirit, and how might we actually go about fostering that creative spirit and creating space for that to be, but also what does that look like? Is something that I'm really interested in, which I'll throw to you in a second. But I guess for me, in my work, I look at, how people foster and build relationships in the workplace, and what does that look like? Simon, as you were saying, it's about creating places of support for people and creating those individual human connections. A big thing that's coming up in my research is some people who I would probably say are great relational people. It starts with a basis of respect for others and seeing other people as other humans, and seeing them on a very basic level, regardless of their expertise or their training or their lived experience. It's seeing people eye to eye as humans, and then having that as a starting base point, I guess.
I think, again, I'm a practicing Aboriginal, which means, I grew up in a Christian household, but I've spent a lot of time understanding my Aboriginality as a theology or as a philosophy. The question that you're asking is just about yourself. Your relationships, everything we do in life is a reflection of how we are with ourselves. So when you seek to do charitable acts or volunteer, you're actually having a relationship with your own internal sense of worth. That's actually what's happening. I often say that Aboriginal theology is very similar to physics as a science, or consciousness, and understanding how that operates. You don't live outside yourself, and the answers are all within yourself. You're a better person all around if you can develop community with yourself, forgiveness, empathy, understanding, reflection, everything that you do in the journey that's the ego operating and not yourself operating to try to make a relationship with your internal communication. This society, when I say this society, the general notion of society as we accept it, is that we unlearn how to have an internal relationship. We externalize everything rather than internalize our own gut and intuition and the magic of that. So you are trained when you're very young to give over that power, and it leads to a society that looks for external indicators about worthiness. The Aboriginal way of thinking, the Aboriginal philosophy, is about maintaining your intuition and your gut understanding of self. So, and you cultivate that. There's, two big fundamental differences. You're not an adult till you're about 35. I think that actually works, because I don't think people are really an adult till 35. But you are encouraged to have an internal discussion constantly and speak to yourself and have trust in yourself. That is a huge well to draw from when you enter any large group activity, whether it's school, university, or workplace or workforce, if you have really healthy dialogue with checking in on yourself. That is what I'm talking about, is a very common way that you and Aboriginal people develop it through totemic relationships. You are conditioned to have trust in nature. Nature is your older brother or sister. You are understood to look to it for observation on any answer that you may have. That's a scientific view. That's about the evolution, that nature was here first, people came afterwards. So it would make logical sense for you to acquiesce to nature when looking for answers. Nature has served every society very well including non-Indigenous people, but you're 300 years away from it more than I am. You forget it can give you medicines and various other ways to heal and behave and be satisfied. We're in a time, I think, globally, that people are wanting that and seeking how to live in that tempo. But I think for leadership, and I think for self-talk and how you create communities, you cannot create a community unless you know how to create a community within yourself. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're functioning in operation. So that's, you might think of it as a job. You're trying to bring people together, but that's not you creating community. You have to give up some of yourself to create a connection, to create community. It can't be an observation, and it can't be an external interaction. It requires you to know yourself and like yourself and feel as though you've got something to offer. And that's all the internal work of maturing and getting to know yourself. But, you know, here's the end of the book, you know, you can't do it any other way. It's just a matter of time whether you agree to go internal to become better external. And I know that sounds very esoteric and maybe it's a bit too much for this session. I don't know, but I mean, I'm old as well. So, you know, it could be that, right? So it's a long time ago since I was a first year uni student. But absolutely, without doubt, COVID is teaching people that the external confidence that the environment that we've created as a culture demands upon us, like that external validation, external interaction, is collapsing as we understand it. That's why we feel nervous, because we're having to recreate something different. But I find it very exciting because it gives you more time with yourself to figure out what really drives you and turns you on and how you really want to connect. So yeah, that would be my view. So don't be a person who goes out and think you can create community when you haven't done the internal work, because I'm the woman that would say you need to do internal work. Don't come and try to create community without doing the internal work.
I'd agree with you. The research also says self-awareness and self-reflection is the first step. Yeah, before you can go out. Anyway.
There's been mention, I think you used the term esoteric, Arabella, and in my conversations prior to this moment with you all, I would love to hear Simon speak to this, because Simon, I feel like you can often present as, one could make a lot of assumptions about an engineer, a male who's a CEO of a firm that sells fans, and I know that you've done this inner work, and I know that you do it with your team. So I'm really curious to hear your reflections and see how that plays out in your organization.
You're right. You're absolutely right. I'm a classic white boy engineer through and through. Yeah. If anybody ever remembers of the Three Johns from Leeds, a punk band from Leeds, they wrote a particularly insulting song about white boy engineers. Look it up. Great bit of punk. I agree, Arabella. I mean, finding oneself is vitally important. You use the word creativity, you use the words humbling to our environment. All of these are significant. That creativity spirit. You mentioned the word adult, which was the only word that you didn't use, Ellen. You know, we have to have respect. We have to respect that we acknowledge our humanness, but we have to treat one another as adults. Even though, you know, as you were saying, Arabella, you know, there is an age at which you become an adult, but most people aren't. Even over the age of 35, most people aren't adults. And certainly in my organization, we have simple philosophies. It's always you before me, and we always treat one another as adults. So we have a creative organization because we have to be. We're facing the challenge of the environmental threats around us. So, you know, we've got, you know, we work in the world of energy efficiency. We've taken 250,000 cars off the road in the last 10 years. That's what we deliver, and we've got to deliver that every day. So, and I don't know what I'm going to be doing in 5 years' time. So I have to have a safe and a safe workplace, that everybody is respectful and working together. And we have a strong leadership team, Kai. Yeah, it's not me as the managing director. All I do is sign the check to pay everybody's salaries. But I have 12 different cultural heritages in my organization. I have a 50% female leadership team. So, you know, we talk about the culture of an organization, Arabella, you know, I've got 12 different cultural heritages, from Germans to Filipinos, to Chinese to Australians. And their understanding of that baseline is all completely different. Yeah. And we have to come together with a direction to make good and make a difference in people's lives. And having integrity in what we do is vital to us. And by integrity, I don't mean, you know, oh, being a jolly good chap, what a very nice ex-Englishman and all of that kind of bits and pieces. I mean, you know, the thing that my mum taught me is that you make a promise. If you make a promise, you keep it, you know, whether it's to, you know, reduce your carbon footprint, or whether it's to assist the person sitting next to you, or whatever. You make a promise and you try and keep it. But in the end of the day, we're human and we break our promises, and that's what it is. But what you do after that is make good. Yeah, that's what Mum always taught me. Yeah, to make good, because we're not perfect. Yeah, so, you know, sometimes, yeah, we do have an oil spillage, or we do let 250,000 salmon free into the Tasmanian waters because that stainless steel cage broke through, and all of that kind of bits and pieces. It'd be interesting to see what that family try and do to make good with respect to that, I think, Sarah. But anyway, we'll see, I'm sure. And those are the philosophies. Ben?
I was just going to say we will see, and I feel like you've, for one, there given some examples of how this actually can play out in the day-to-day. A reminder of going back to Alan's quote initially of what we as engineers do actually serve into, and time again remembering that we are relational beings, and and we can't systemize or Gantt chart or whatever it is that out. And talking about relational beings, we have some folk who would like to relate to our guests. And I believe we have, if we're ready for some questions to come in, we've got, is it Nayan who's going to beam into the room?
Yes, that's Nayan. Yes, correct. Hi, everyone.
Hello, please.
Yep. So basically, my question is mostly motivated by Alan's quote and Kaj's proposition of introducing empathy as a educational culture. I believe anyone who tries to solve a problem is an engineer. But as engineer, we are kind of hardwired to think, to break the complex things into quite simpler things. But then sometimes we need to again look back and think of the bigger picture. So my question is, how do we do that? Like as an engineer, we're always taught to break the things into simpler terms, but then again, we are expected to think into a bigger picture as well. That's my first question. I believe community engagement could be introduced as well, to see how community interacts and how diverse are the issues at the societal level. Probably that's one thing, introduction of a social engineering kind of a subject, or maybe something like that. I'm not quite sure. That's my first question. And the second question relates to the first one. Although we are trying to increase or improve the interaction with the community, given the COVID-19 scenario and going forward with the remoteness, how likely it would affect that particular philosophy or theory?
So that was to Kai and or Alan. Could you just go with the first question there? Can you give us a summary of that first and second question?
Yeah, the first question was that as an engineer, we are quite hardwired to solve a complex problem into a simpler one. But then sometimes we have to look back, and also we are expected to see the bigger pictures. So how do we achieve that? is it best at a educational level to get introduced to a subject such as social engineering or community engagement, just to know what actually the ground realities are, what are expected at the ground level, and how we solve a problem? Is it something, that kind of things gonna...
So it's kind of like a, how do we hold these various levels of work? How do we almost, correct me if I'm wrong there, but sit in this discomfort of going, I need to look at this piece and then I need to broaden out to a wider view.
Quite correct.
It's a great question, Nayan, and I can answer this not from the perspective of a practicing engineer. So I'm going to hand this very quickly over to perhaps Simon and Ellen to give a more concrete response. But I think I've thought about this from my perspective over the last 6 to 12 months in particular, as a question of altitude. So I actually think we're all relatively good when we're told to stay at a particular altitude, including engineers, despite our hardwired education, as you phrased it. I think if we're told to look at a system as an engineer, we're actually pretty good. We can sort of analyze the inputs, the outputs, how things work, how things relate to another, what happens if A, B, and C happens in particular orders, or whatever the complex challenge might be. And then, as you say, we're also very good if you give us a very discrete problem and you're boiling it down to that very discrete problem at solving that. The challenge that we have, I think, is that when we go up and down too fast, because what happens then? We get altitude sickness. Like, we become like yo-yos, and we're not good at, I don't think anyone is really particularly good at that. So when we're studying, we're told, it was sort of taught to think at various levels. I think that is true, but we're not told how to transition between them in a way that makes us feel comfortable and not out of our depth. And I think my answer from a structural perspective is less about community engagement, and maybe to Arabella's initial reflections, I think it starts with ethics and philosophy. I think there's a baseline understanding of how to think well, of where empathy starts and stops, where our kind of philosophical basis of thinking comes from, that would help us in navigating those different altitudes. I think that's where the kind of that's maybe how we avoid some of that altitude sickness.
That makes sense. Thank you so much. Yep, it makes sense to transit quite seamlessly through various levels. Yep. Thank
Simon,
you.
how do we do that in practice?
That's easy, mate. We drink lots and lots of tea. Yeah, Nine. Absolutely. Drink as much tea as you possibly can. It's what would be the first thing I would recommend. But also, Nine, you wear glasses, yeah?
Yeah.
So the second thing I would recommend is you take your glasses off and give them to me, and I'll take my glasses off and I'll give them to you. Always try and put yourself in somebody else's shoes. To look back upon yourself and look back at upon what you do. So in other words, take yourself out of that picture and put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And if that means sitting next to somebody and asking them, what do you think I'm being a complete bloody idiot? Yeah, it's always a good question to ask, as long as you respect the person who you're asking, because you know that they'll tell you the truth. Yeah, always try and take yourself out from the outside, and if that means wearing other glasses or talking to somebody else, then you'll always get a different perspective. Whether you see the big picture, I don't know, but you'll always see a different perspective, and that'll guide you in always a different direction. But tea, mate, tea, lots of tea.
Thanks for that advice. I would take tea.
I have a different suggestion, a very practical one, which I have used on engineers and they accept it. So I'll try it on you. Again, physics is the clue. Your brain thinks in pictures. Dreaming is the answer to what you need to learn better about being able to get outside a problem. Allow yourself to dream. And if you need to understand the logic of that, then go to physics. Because when you dream and you start to fantasize and imagine a problem, what happens is your brain creates pictures, which then move to the front of your brain, and you draw on those pictures to give you a position on which way you're going forward. So the logical part of your engineer brain is probably saying, I don't understand what dreaming could do. I'm telling you to explore the fundamentals of how neurons work and brains format pictures and thinking in your mind, and use that as a principle for delivery. So when you have a problem, dream it and think about it, suspend it in your mind, learn the art of daydreaming and dreaming well for purpose. It's a different way to use your mental capacity. And it really does help alleviate the stress of the particular or isolated problem. That is fundamental for how your brain works, and you can activate your brain that way. I think the discipline of doing that should be encouraged. And I think that in engineering in particular, like other sciences and other creative forces, the encouragement to daydream a problem and to daydream a solution, or even deliberately try to dream that way, is a really good way to use your brain. So if you need to be convinced that I'm not just giving you some airy-fairy position, yeah, like, please just, have a look. It's, it's real science, but it helps an engineer really understand how to use their best logic and bring a forward thought to the front of your mind to then work towards that.
Einstein did exactly the same
Exactly.
thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Einstein was the great user.
That is the Aboriginal notion of the dreaming. That's what it's about. It's about consciousness and being able to imagine something forward, so you're going in that direction. So that's a very practical lesson on how to get the best out of that.
Can I put it in a way that
I might actually cut in there so that we have time for one more question. So thank you so much for coming into.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for being brave and coming in. We have Mitra coming into the room.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. So my screen just did strange things as I came in.
You're in.
Yeah. Obviously this conversation has gone in a very different direction from when I asked my question initially. But it seems to me that as engineers, we exist within bigger systems and communities. And I started my question responding to Arabella's comment about the lack of engineering for COVID. And in practice, I've seen tons of COVID-related engineering. But for Western countries, it's stuck behind the incredible regulatory bureaucrat that we've designed into our systems. For example, I advise one company that's had $1 antiviral masks that could be being sold now, but they're stuck behind months and months of regulatory bureaucrat. But I mean, obviously EWB works mainly in the global south, and there it's embedded in very different systems where cost is often the biggest issue. And I'm wondering, I've seen lots of projects completely ignoring cost because in practice, their customer is the donor, not the beneficiary. So can we ever solve problems at the scale of the problem until we can get our volunteer student engineers to radically design for low cost and keep that at the front of their thinking, and in a way ignore the things that have been baked in for working within a Western bureaucrat and lawyer-led system?
Oh, what a question. All right, who is up? That has just jazzed me. Go for it, Simon.
I'm going to take your second item first, mate. Cost. I'm sorry, everything's too cheap. It really is. Why should I pay $1 for a t-shirt? That's disrespectful of every person that's been involved in manufacturing that product.
But that's for the West. I'm talking about where water treatment, where people have. I worked on energy in Africa for years, and the daily energy budget, sorry, the weekly energy budget of a family is $2, and most of our Western volunteers cannot design around a $2 a week product.
Mate, I've lived there. I've lived on $10 a month for 2.5 years. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, through and through. And they're different worlds. There are different cost bases for different communities all the way around the world. Mm-hmm. And that's what it'll be. But one of the big devices of all communities has been this drive for lower and lower cost. I think it's outrageous that I buy a car for $20,000.
Agree.
It should be twice that price. It really should. That's what value. That's the value that's been put into that engineering. With respect to bureaucracy, it's a complete nightmare, mate. I negotiate with the government with respect to energy efficiency and the regulations in our industry, and they drive me around the bend. I'd sack them tomorrow. I'm sorry, I really, really would. But I've got to get through them. I've got to get through them because they're there because for a fail-safe to protect us as community and all this kind of bits and pieces. But I have to find a way, and the voice we were talking about earlier, Ellen, that engineering voice that's persuasive, that's influential, that a politician will listen to me, you know, and we just have to just bite our lip and find a way to change the national construction codes, which is what we've done, and that kind of stuff. To take the moment, like you were saying, Kai, you know, to take that moment and to take that moment to influence people for better. And everybody can do it, you know, whether we're a PhD student, Ellen, it's all yours, mate. You've got it there, or two, you know, serious strategists, you know, such as you two guys. So, you know, you've got.
So that sort of speaks to some of that bureaucracy there, and then this other part of the question is around this almost less so designing for lower cost, but supporting the learning of our engineers to be able to. Has anything come up there and say, yeah, Simon?
I'm going to have another go, mate.
Yeah.
I'm coming back to what you were saying at the beginning, Kai, and what you were saying, Arabella, with respect to creativity. You know, the problems that we face as a community, we don't have the immediate solutions. You know, the vaccine that we've created for C19 was unknown 6 months ago. The DNA manipulation was, but the vaccine wasn't. You know, and we've been able to solve that solution. We've got to create solutions going forward to reduce our carbon footprint and to reduce the heating in the environment. And we've got to be creative for what that is. That's not going to be cheap, and we've got to create the value in that. Yeah, because we've got to understand what the value of taking a ton of carbon out of the environment is, and persuading the people that it's important and that it's more than $500.
Are there any adjacent or building on views from others of our guests?
I was also thinking about kind of the question about almost like that idea of education and learning and growing and things like that. And I think similar to what Simon was saying about putting on someone else's glasses, I don't wear glasses, and it is actually one disability that I don't understand. Sometimes when people tell me they can't see when they wake up in the morning, I'm like, what are you talking about? I forget that people take off their glasses. And that's the thing, checking yourself and approaching a conversation and approaching anything that you approach with a recognition that your knowledge, your understanding, your experience is not the same as others. And it's also not the best necessarily. It's not the be all and end all. There are other ways to consider what's going on. And if you're coming into a space that's not your own and not your own culture and things like that, even within your own culture, you can't assume that you know what you're stepping into. And as a designer, it's your responsibility to understand more around that. And so that would be what I would say is to, whenever you're encountering something, I almost want to make it the first step of the design process to check all of your assumptions and check your biases before you begin. That's the first step of the recipe, is actually to check yourself out. But yeah, to approach just by asking, showing up. There's ideas in improv that you just show up and you just ask and you're there and you're present, and you try and find out things from there, and just don't assume that you know. You have limitations to your knowledge, and other people are magnificent and they also have answers and solutions. You just need to listen.
Thanks, Ellen. It makes me it makes me consider oh, damn it, I've just lost my train of thought. They're holding too many. Any more comments from my guests whilst I grab it? Otherwise we can start to move toward our wrap up, because this time has flown. Just lovely smiles all around. All right. Well, in that case, I would like to make comment on some of the extraordinary and detailed questions that we're seeing here in the Q&As, and noticing as well that we won't have time to get to any more questions, and we won't actually be, in the past sometimes we've followed up and answered questions within our follow-up email after a webinar, but today we're not going to, and there's real purpose in that. it's because these questions, consider the messages from within yourself of things that are sparking from you, sparking within you, sparking from this conversation, and ones that you would like to explore yourself. I would anticipate that somewhere in there's a bit of a gem around the role that you want to play in this engineering space, or seeing as all spaces are interrelated in this whole life thing. We'll also hold on to some of those questions to get a bit of a better understanding of what our audience is trying to unpack at this time, as we being EWB Australia navigates this next decade, and how we best support our network to navigate it alongside us. And on that, because we have these fantastic guests in the room, I am going to almost ask a bit of a greedy question, and we don't have a heap of time left. So somewhat rapid fire. I'd like you to consider, what is the role of EWB Australia in service to a future which is inclusive, regenerative, and whole? From your viewpoint, what role do you see that EWB could be playing? And that could be a bit of where or how do we need to step up. So I've got Alan. Alan seems to be jumping out on my screen, so I'm going to pop over to you, Alan, first. You look like a bit, oh no. Feel free to take a moment to breathe into it.
This doesn't quite sit with the rapid fire. I guess I think something I've always respected about EWB is that it lives out its values very strongly. And something that's been coming up in conversations all this week I've been having with people is about values, and Simon also just mentioned it. I think, I guess, a key strength of EWB is relationships, and almost like teaching people how to foster positive relationships between groups, and how to reach out to people and live out, I'd say sometimes some people might find the more radical values around transparency and honesty and vulnerability. And so maybe EWB's place could be helping to foster those places of vulnerability that great things can happen in, that people might be uncertain, and getting groups together in a room and helping them create something, but creating that safer space, which we maybe don't find very frequently.
Thank you. Fostering a place to enable vulnerability in the technical sector. Go to Arabella, and then Kai, and then we'll wrap up quickly with Simon.
Okay, I think there's a difference between values and goals. Goals is what you may pursue. Values is how you feel about what that pursuit does for you. So if EWB offers something, it may be to translate people's goals of being an engineer to be value rich, and to create a value around that, because it requires an internal disposition and not an external function. So you can achieve a goal, so complete my degree to be an engineer, that is a goal. That is not the same as achieving a value or having a value-led life. So if EWB wants to resonate with the future, it's to understand that more sharply and offer an opportunity to combine that and resonate with those that are going through the pursuit of a goal or want to add value to that goal. And that is an internal discussion within yourself, then mirrored through the extension of what your skill or your application of giving is to the world. It's, it is philosophical, it is theological, it is social, it's very broad. The other rudimentary part, of course, is how you use your humanness to make the best of your skill, how you connect to other parts of your skill to bring to life your goal. And it's a big ask, but the truth is no one's really focused on doing that. So you might as well do that. You're already in the giving space. Now you have to work out how you can give to engineers to a way to allow them to live in a values position, but also manage themselves in a way that makes sense for them and allows them to give their fullest self in a meaningful way. So that's where I would say the focus should be. And you need to be bold enough to say that is the target, so that all the engineers who are out there who are sitting there going, this job is nothing more like I expected, I'm not satisfied, you bring them into the motion of creating better communities, that they don't just leave and go do something else. Because we need lots of engineers in lots of different spaces. So that would be my advice.
Thank you. We'll capture them like we've captured Kai and kept him in engineering for at least a few years longer. Over to you, Kai.
Thanks, Arabella. Wonderful reflections. I look forward to seeing the visualization of all of this. I guess my sense of what EWB has always done really well, and I think can sort of double down on at a time like this, is sort of encouraging us as a community not to shy away from two really important questions that we are really often told not to talk about unconsciously. And those two questions are, what is your version of the good society? And the good society in the deeply philosophical sense. So we are traditionally engineers taught to be pragmatic and problem solvers. And I think what we need to do is not swing all the way towards idealism, but we need to find the spot in between. We need to find our way to a pragmatic idealism, which I think is actually a superpower if we can find our way there. And the second question that I think we need to double down on is to encourage all of us to think about what our good life looks like in that society. So what is our good life, which is a deeply personal question that actually requires years of thinking. It's not something we come to in any short amount of time. But in my time with Engineers Without Borders, I've met person after person who's wanted to engage in those conversations. And I'd encourage people to directly ask each other those questions. There are also, maybe I'll put a few of the books that have helped me get to some answer, or at least get answers to start progressing. They're probably never done. I'll put them in the chat. And then maybe the last thing I'll do is please do have a look at the Mastery of Business and Empathy that we've just put into the world that starts next year. It's a 9-month program. It's all online due to COVID. And it really is looking at how we reinvent and extend the MBA, which we believe is an incredibly broken model of education in terms of nurturing and developing our leaders. So it takes very much an approach on that inner work and the outer work dynamic. It looks at rebalancing. It looks at systemic transformation. So yeah, take a look at that. I'll put a link in there as well. But I think EWB has always been good at asking those two questions, and I think we should continue to do so. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Kai. And Simon, you're...
I'm going to build on the...
Give me a one sentencer.
Yeah, that's all I've got left, yeah. I'm just going to build on exactly what you were saying there, Kai, with respect to a good life. I mean, I always look to... I'm an engineer, and I always look to the role of an EWB to make me think, to challenge the way I think, to challenge my thoughts, to think about that good life thing that you were just questioning there, Kai, and to challenge my paradigms with respect to my relation to community. And I think EWB has always done that, and I look to EWB to continue doing that. And as long as I'm a board member, I'll keep sticking my thumb in that one, mate.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you so much, Kai, Arabella. Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you to all of our attendees here tonight. Look out for a follow-up email. Whilst I'm speaking to this, perhaps we can pop up our extraordinary art that's been building, and I'll just speak for another moment on what to expect next before we close. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. So look out for this follow-up email. We'll pop in some of those links that Kai has sent. And and an invitation to start the conversation with us. It sounds like this is continually the calling of EWB to foster these spaces. We'll also include this extraordinary art and links to some other things that should keep this thinking and conversations going. Please don't stop the conversations. Please join us on our journey into the future. We will continue to create the spaces for you to be able to dive into these topics together boldly and with vulnerability. It's been an absolute treat to host tonight. We're a couple of minutes over time, so I best leave it there. With a great deal of gratitude, I send you on your way. Good night.